Hey guys, this is Kenjiro and welcome to another Make Shop Pro video. In a previous video, I covered using the background eraser tool and just how effective and helpful it is when you're trying to isolate a subject from a consistent color or a homogeneous background. And it excels at that. But what I wanted to cover today was an example of trying to isolate a subject from a much more difficult background. And just to be upfront about it, there's no magic tool or there's no simple trick that's going to get you there. It is very manual and it takes a lot of work. But as I go through an example, I'm going to point out just some tips and tricks that can be applied doing this much more manual process. So let's get to it. So just looking at our starting image, which I got off of pexels.com, you can see that there's a lot of things that the background eraser would struggle with if we just tried to use it outright. There's a lot of luminance variation, there's a lot of color variation, but even more so, you have a lot of similarity between the background colors and the color of the subject. And our goal, obviously, being trying to isolate the girl from the background. So now one good technique to do at the beginning of one of these processes is to explore the image itself and some of the attributes of it. Because really what we're trying to do is find ways to be able to isolate her from the background. And maybe that's via luminance, maybe that's via color. And really we want to focus on parts that are going to be really hard, like the hair, for example. So one of the things I like to do is just start experimenting by doing some splits on the image, whether by color, RGB, or by CMYK or HSL. And if one of those seems to work out pretty well, then saving that, putting it as a new layer on your image so that we can use it either for selections or for background erasing capability. So I found one. We'll use this one, you'll see later when we're trying to get a little bit more detail on the hair. So now that we've kind of at least found one opportunity for making our life easier using a different part of the image, I am in fact going to start working with the background eraser, because even though this image is going to be more difficult, it still has a lot of capability that, if used very judiciously, will help us in the long run. So here I am starting with some pretty broad values, like a pretty large size to the eraser and a pretty high sharpness. But you can see, even as I'm erasing near her arm, it's already starting to cut away at the arm. So there's enough similarity between what the sampling region is and her figure that it's erasing into it. So I'm going to have to approach that a different way later. But coming back around to the other side, it's very important, since there's so much variation in the background, that and you can't just drag all the way across and hope that whatever that sampling region is going to be consistent enough for it to erase along the line. So you'll see a lot of times I'm really just single clicking at different points and different regions of the background area, and making sure to just slightly overlap with the edge between her face and the background. At any point, if you feel like as you're erasing, it's erasing too much, you just have to Control Z or undo to back it out and try again. So now coming to the back of the neck, same thing. There's just too much similarity between the background and the skin color that too much of it's being erased. Now, also in this area, one thing that you can do to try to reclaim some areas that are erased too much is to simply just right click, and that will unerase. So right click and drag to bring back some areas that it went a little bit too far. And we're going to follow this technique all the way around, right? And what you'll see, especially around the areas of the hair, is I'm really barely overlapping with the hair. I'm really mostly focusing. It's almost like I'm really just erasing around the edge rather than really trying to benefit from what the background eraser is doing. But especially as you get to like the hair, like we've seen in my other video, really soft edges, you'll want to change the sharpness and bring it down a little bit, just so that it's not erasing or looking for a hard edge to try to find the distinction between the subject you care about and the erased background. We're going to clean up the hair later after we've placed her on the new background, and you'll see why, because blending's a lot easier to do when you have the background that you are going to end up with as a reference. So once you get at least a base outline of isolation using the background eraser, we can use the freehand tool and just draw a very loose line around that whole region, and then invert that selection that's created there and then delete everything. So looking at this, we have a pretty good start. Now, all the difficult areas really haven't been addressed. The easy parts have, but the difficult portions haven't. And so this is where we're going to start experimenting and using other tools to try to get there. So at certain points, just for cleanup purposes, I'll switch to the regular eraser. And this is just to get some of the floating regions that really weren't handled well by the background eraser. So now coming back to the side where her arm was and the background eraser wasn't doing such a good job, I'm switching to freehand and using Smart Edge. And so in this way, I can have the Smart Edge just detect exactly where her arm is and then just cut a small region out and delete. And now we have a nice clean cut where her arm is on that side. So already having used 3 different methods of erasing: background eraser, freehand selection, and the regular eraser. And then continuing on with the regular eraser just to clean up different regions. Again, very manual. So now coming to the region of greatest difficulty, which is sort of these twirls of hair to our right side of her head. Really just trying to find points of contrast, right? That are different than the colors of the hair. We are going to use that other layer that I saved to get us more detail, but even right now, really just trying to leverage the background eraser to remove just some major areas where there's a difference, a significant difference in color that'll make it a little easier. And then once again, to try to get that area right along the chin, going back to the freehand with the Smart Edge, and you can see it creates a nice clean cut right around where the chin wraps around to the cheek. And then once again, manually erasing just different parts of the background that we know we won't need. And especially when dealing with hair, as I'm starting to erase, you'll see that I'm playing a lot of times with hardness and opacity because it's all about just trying to get that blend. So then now at this stage, we'll try to use this one particular split of the layers because this creates a lot of separation between the hair twirls and the background, uh, just because it stands out as being very white. So we can now use the magic wand selection tool, and adjust the tolerance till we grab about as much hair detail as we can without selecting too much outside of that region. So again, this is very much a experimentation and tweaking sort of activity until you get it the way you want it. And just to allude a little bit to the future, um, this type of masking, erasing, whatever you want to call it, is extremely difficult, right? It is very time consuming, and depending on really how much of these very barely perceptible hairs blended so deeply with the background that you want to maintain is really going to dictate how much effort you're going to put into it. So in my case, to simplify isolating, I'm actually going to duplicate the original image, and then I'm going to invert the selection and delete. So then really all that's left in this one particular layer is just this selected region of hair. And now erasing the image underneath, the layer underneath, what we get is just more the detail that represents the selection we created on that higher layer. It's pretty coarse, and it really, a lot of detail kind of gets lost in the process. A lot of fidelity gets lost in the process, honestly, in this case. And this is where it just comes back to you have to kind of decide which elements of detail you really care about and preserve. Do you want to preserve the shape of the hairs? Do you want to preserve the texture? Do you want to just preserve sort of that lots of holes coming through and a very strand like look? It all That's where a lot of the artistic part comes into play, and also recognizing what is it that you're going for with your final image. Like how much of that detail do you have to preserve? So now we're getting into the stage where it's going to be important to see how the image is going to blend with the background um, as we're about to start blending. So I'm going to add the background color, which is for the sake of preserving that nice contrast of color between the purple and the yellow she's wearing. I'm going to make a purple background. And just to give it some variation, I'm going to add a fill of a vignette. So we have the new background now that we're going to try to put her in front of. And so then all these regions around the hair that we've kind of left, unpolished is now what we can focus on and try to blend. And what you'll see is I'm using the regular eraser at this point with a lower hardness and a decreased opacity. And then really just going around the edges and trying to follow the shape of the hair. Remembering also that if at any point you erase a little bit too far, you can always right click to unerase a region. And in some ways, this can actually be important to achieve a specific kind of geometry that can't be achieved by such a large round eraser. Another point I'll make as we're kind of just cruising through this stage is that this type of process and this kind of detail of erasing and blending is facilitated by having a higher resolution image. If you have a lower resolution image, you have a lot less data to work with. And so small aberrations stand out more. You're going to get a lot more pixelation, or you're going to get a lot more aliasing. But if you have a higher resolution image, you can really zoom into these different points of detail and work your way to make it blend a lot more consistently and a lot more convincingly. Now, as we get more to focusing on this very difficult strand of hair on the right side of her head, I'm going to just merge that layer with the bottom one just so that my erasing can be consistent across all the different parts of the image. But again, working with a low opacity, low hardness, just to get that blending to occur at all the different points of the hair strands being somewhat translucent, somewhat transparent. I think it's also important to change your zoom as you're kind of working here, because you want to kind of get a sense of how this looks from afar, like the view that most people will have when they view it, but then also zooming in to get that fine detail as you're manipulating and painting out and erasing the different hair pieces. So you'll see that I zoom in and out pretty regularly. So as we're coming to the end here, and you can tell that I'm not very happy with how this hair strands on the right side is coming out. And partially because I think I like that the selection kind of gave us some of those nice holes and regions that make it look a lot like actual hair, over a new solid background. But the way the strands are, it just, is very difficult without like making a 5-hour video to make this really blend well. So this is one of the situations where I'm going to exert some artistic freedom, and instead of trying to preserve that hair region as exactly as it was in the original image, I'm going to kind of shape it so that, it kind of mirrors the hair on the other side, but doesn't try to preserve all that, kind of broken look, and the twirls not really falling the way that they should. And so again, the point being here just that you really have to kind of decide what is important and where can you give yourself a little bit of margin and save yourself some time, and where is it really important to actually spend time on those kinds of details. So after all that effort and all of that manual switching of brushes between the regular eraser, the background eraser, doing selections and using the smart edge and all those tools, this is the final cutout of the girl from a much more complex background and put onto a new background of our own. So having gone through all of this, um, if you know ahead of time that an image you're taking or a photo that you're taking, you're going to want to isolate the subject from the background, just by comparing this video with the background eraser video I have, you can see how With a homogeneous background, the background eraser will get this job done no problem, and maybe with only one setting that you have to, manipulate in the background eraser tool. But with a much more complicated background, you can spend a lot more time and a lot more energy, and you're going to have to be tweaking your tools a whole lot more to try to get, as equally a clean a look. And in some cases, you may have to sacrifice, like I did, parts of the image for it to really look decent, if you will, right? So that's it for me. Like I said, no magic tool, no magic bullet, no magic method that's just going to get you there on a really difficult background. It's a difficult background because it's difficult. But I hope you were able to learn some tips and tricks, some good practices that can help you with complex images like these. And as always, if you have any questions or recommendations for content, feel free to leave a comment. If you like the content and you want to be notified of newer stuff when it's available, feel free to subscribe. And otherwise, I will see you guys next time.